Number of things to cover in a relatively short period of time. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the experience and lessons learned from salt iodization, including legislation and enforcement issues and supplies. I'm going to talk a little bit about iodized salt in processed foods. Then we're going to have some discussion about salt as a potential vehicle for other fortificants. And then at the end, we're going to have a panel discussion. The panel will consist predominantly of people with industry experience or active in the industry at the moment. And I'm hoping that that will generate some further questions about this interplay between public health and the salt production. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Katia Diaz, who is the country director for the GAIN program, focusing on fortification from Mozambique.
Morning to all. Thank you, Robin, for the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about critical issues around implementation of salt iodization. They apply to food fortification, actually. We work in Mozambique, and we have one of the, should I say, more inclusive food fortification strategy. We have 5 vehicles because micronutrient deficiencies is a serious health issue in Mozambique. Salt is the oldest. It means that the country started salt iodization, a national program, in '99. But since 2011, we are also working with sugar, oil, wheat flour, and maize flour. So we need all hands on deck in Mozambique. And I kind of selected three pictures that really represent the Mozambique experience and what we've seen. As you can see, we have large producers, and I was talking to my colleague, Garcês, that is apparently considered a large producer, but most of our salt is sold, as you can see, in little cans, in the wet markets, in the informal markets, and when consumer buys it, usually doesn't have iodine anymore. So, how does this, nope. The green? Okay, thank you. Just quick overview, I would go on the Mozambique-USI context, some of the overview of common barriers and priorities for improving regulatory monitoring, examples of enablers, and also summarizing some of the actors and priorities to improve regulatory monitoring. I'm going to be talking from a global perspective, but then I will give you very concrete the very concrete Mozambique experience and what we are doing in country. So, quite quickly, for most of you that don't know where Mozambique is, we are in the Indian Ocean. We border Tanzania, South Africa, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. We are only 28 million. We are a very large country with a small population. We are a very young population. 45% are less than 15 years, and more than 50% are less than 18 years old. And unfortunately, stunting is one of the highest in the world, 43% on average, but we have provinces that have 55% of children suffering from stunting, and our literacy level is quite low still, only 56%. Mozambique is the 10th largest producers of salt in Africa. We could be one of the biggest considering our shoreline. Unfortunately, we are not doing a good use of our shoreline, and if you see, our shoreline really is similar to South Africa, but did I do something? But as you can see, our production is quite low. Was it me? Producers are concentrated in 3 main provinces. One is Nampula and Cabo Delgado, and then on the south, in Maputo, with a few producers in Inhamban. All of these are provinces of Mozambique. Mozambique has 11 provinces. And unfortunately, we have what we can consider small, medium, and large producer. We only have 23, but then we have over 400 what can be considered micro producers that really don't have access to technology, to energy, to packaging, to iodine. And those are, of course, one of the challenges the country has, and hearing Noor talk about the challenges on consolidation, this is the big step that we need, the solution that we need to find to Mozambique. So we are considered, and we are mildly, our deficiency is considered mild. And, but in terms of compliance, last time we did a survey, only 45% of households had access to iodized salt, and it was not even correctly iodized. When it goes to correctly iodized within what is the normal range and our national standards, it drops below 20%. And what I'll be talking today is about, of course, the monitoring and the quality assurance, quality control. We decided to leave, of course, the internal quality control and quality assurance, although it's a big problem in Mozambique. Unfortunately, our sophistication level in terms of producing salt is still has a lot of improvements to have, but we decided to focus on the external monitoring because it's also one of the big challenges that we have in country. One of the recent papers that was published by my colleagues from headquarters, it's all about regulatory monitoring of fortified foods, including barriers and good practices. It was a study that, how do I go back? It is a study that that takes quality assurance, quality control data from 20 countries, but also interviewed 11 fortification experts, 15 countries' regulatory agencies, and food processing industry in 30 countries. And some of the findings are quite interesting. What we are seeing is that there is limited impact in iodization and generally in food fortification. And you'll see that compliance is a big issue, and the regulatory monitoring has a very important role to play in ensuring that the consumer access products that are fortified, and of course salt that is correctly iodized. And what we've seen is that there is a strong indicator of non-fortified or under-fortified or non-iodized or under-iodized foods in a lot of countries, but they still claim to be fortified. So some of the monitoring that we do internally, because we have a lot of fortification projects in many countries ongoing, and we've seen that at least 50% of products are not iodized or fortified, and so that means that we have a systemic problem in terms of compliance for several causes, of course, and of course misleading the consumer is a big issue. And although in many of the countries that we operate and that we support the food fortification or the salt iodization programs, consumers still don't have a strong voice. In other countries that will change as our countries rapidly urbanize and our consumers become much more informed. So some of the barriers that have identified, and you'll see I haven't done any remark regarding Mozambique because unfortunately all of this applied. So in terms of government, we do have a government that has the political will to do it, but then it has a lot of times there's low priority, not the case in Mozambique, but there's low capacity to enforce, which means that our regulatory agencies and our inspection agencies don't have the will or the power to really go enforce some of our laws around food fortification. So there's also minimal harmonization of standards and legislation. This becomes a problem for countries like Mozambique, that we export a lot of salt, for instance, for our neighboring countries. There's also limited funding, and we must say that the budgets of governments are always a barrier to enforce food fortification, because if there's no money for fuel or no money to do tests or no money to train the inspectors, then it's difficult to ensure that private sector is compliant with the law. So limited personnel for legal action means that hardly any case reaches the courts. Corruption is a big problem. I think, at least in Mozambique, we know it is a big problem that government is trying to fight. The laboratory capacity, although equipment is there, a lot of times the equipment are not working. They don't have staff that really knows how to operate. Mozambique has a beautiful HPLC that it stopped. For 5 years it hasn't worked because there is no money for the reagents, or there's no staff to really maintain such a sophisticated equipment working. And of course, there's very limited capacity to really do quick tests that gives you a yes, no answer and allows you to take samples or to really probe further the market or the producers. In terms of industry, and once again, Mozambique has a very unsophisticated industry, but a big potential to grow and to become an exporter and be self-sufficient. One of the big problems that we have is the imports of potassium iodide. For many years, UNICEF gave it for free to producers, but when they stopped that free distribution, that's when we stepped in to try to find sustainable models, which means that producers are struggling to understand how they buy something as simple as potassium iodide, or even equipment, or do the maintenance. So this is an issue that we are working with the producers and the government in Mozambique. Poor quality or unsafe inputs, including packaging, production, testing equipment, iodization equipment. Noor talked about Snapchat sex, still a problem. We still have very little industry that have proper equipment to do iodization, proper equipment to test if their salt is correctly iodized. Poor processing procedures and expertise, lack of SOPs and documentation. Traceability is something that really doesn't exist in the industry. Lack of adequate internal laboratory capacity, and of course limited training also from their staff. Packaging and handling is an issue. Most of the producers don't use packaging that is fit for purpose in terms of salt that is iodized. And most of the salt is also then packed in 25 kilograms, and then it's resold loose, which means that iodine will not reach the consumer. And sometimes, of course, there's the under-fortification in an attempt to cut costs. This is Mozambique. We just finished food safety and quality sector assessment, where we did an analysis to all the established producers. We left out the micro and informal producers. And for those that are from the salt industry, unfortunately, there's a lot of work to be done. Quite interesting, even the producers think that salt is a bulletproof product, that they can produce as whatever, that nothing will come out of there. And there's not even the conscious that salt can pose a food safety threat. So also from the same study, we've seen that, of course, the priorities that the respondents did and to ensure compliant fortification and iodization, one of them is clear regulations. Many countries have regulations, but a lot of times we know that people do find loopholes. And in Mozambique, for instance, we have a decree and we have a diploma that both of them talk about salt. And this is an issue, for instance, that we need to sort in country. It's not possible to have two different legal instruments that talk about salt iodization, because I usually say to the government, if I was on the other side, I'll see you in court. I'm not on the other side for many years. Also, in terms of inspection and enforcement, I think penalties I usually say that we need the stick and the carrot. I do think that we need first the carrot, which means that we need to create an enabling environment for private sector to iodize. And penalties, of course, I think should be used when necessary, but I think it is important to make sure that the private sector has an enabling environment to be correctly iodizing or fortifying their products. And of course, there's always, and in Mozambique also, some tension where the government is sometimes afraid to be too hard, because in an emergent economy like Mozambique, we don't want to put producers out of business. We need them to continue to produce, to contribute to GDP, to create, to have people employed, to export products. So there's always a fine line that I think every government kind of assess before pressing and going to court and really enforcing the law. So what means is that there's usually, in many countries like Mozambique, inconsistent follow-through and lack of effective enforcement strategy. And I think this is quite common, and I've seen it in other countries. I've worked in other countries, and it's a big issue, is where you find the balance. So also, funding. Funding is always a problem, and Mozambique is a good example. Once UNICEF stepped out from giving potassium iodate for free, we had producers running around like chickens without heads, knowing no idea where to get the potassium iodide. It took 1 year for them to be able to import the first batch of potassium iodide. And also, many times the funding from the government is also very sustained, and a lot of times is not used on the most effective way. And it's very important to have public-private partnerships that can leverage the key drivers to do capacity strengthening, trust build, and funding to continue improvements. This is what we've been doing in Mozambique. We, for instance, just opened a call for proposals where salt producers could apply if they needed to improve their technology of production, if they needed to renew their salt iodization, if they needed machines to pack salt. We received 114 applicants. We do hope that there's a lot of salt producers in there, because this is funding coming from a donor that could be used, of course, to improve their technology and their production capability. So, also, better information systems. I'm looking at Nilza and the team from Mozambique. It's me, it's Nilza, that is the National Deputy Director of Industry. Salt iodization program is under her. And of course, Sr. Garcês is the Salt Association representative, and one we were discussing if he's a large producer, if he's a medium. He says he's a medium producer, I say he's a large. We know that the information is very important, but for instance, in Mozambique, we don't have it. We have a database that hasn't been updated since 2013, and we had to do almost a census going to all provinces in the country to really understand how many people and how many industries and how many small producers were producing salt. So having data, it's a very important enabler, and we need to have better data systems, and Mozambique really needs one. And what we are trying to do also in Mozambique is to integrate the system for all fortified products. Another thing is, of course, it's very nice that government is talking about iodization or fortification as development markers. We also talked about that. I usually say that international NGOs are not really the civil society of a country. And so involving the civil society, the consumer defense seems to be a big enabler because they play a very important role more on the stick side, meaning that they can voice the consumer demand for fortified products and iodized products. And it's also they can do much more quicker in a much more quicker way. They can do independent compliance surveys. And at the moment, for instance, the consumer defense in Mozambique is doing monthly checks, what we call market monitorings, where they go market by market, or at least the formal markets, in most of the 11 provinces in Mozambique. There is a platform that uploads even their GPS presence, and that they can immediately set up information if the product is packed, if it's not packed, if it bears the logo, and then they collect samples and send it to be tested in the laboratory. It's something that is going really well. And if you guys speak Portuguese or understand a little bit of Portuguese, you can go to the Pro Consumers webpage and you can see what is done every month, and even ping the GPSs where all of these market assessments are being done. So another example that I was bringing is from South Africa that is working with consumer and media. We are following their steps and making sure that the civil society is playing a strong role in food fortification and salt iodization. Then from Kyrgyzstan, we also understood that retail can help regulate. And this is something that we have seen and also is happening in Mozambique. When our inspectorate government body started to enforce on the retailing, we could see that the biggest retailers stopped buying products that were not fortified and salt that was not iodized. It was a really good help, because at least for the bigger producers that have those retailers as big clients, they are a big source of income, and making sure that those retailers are aware that they should be complying also of the law, and that there's also a legal risk with them if they don't comply with the law, then it did help. We could see that the moment retailers started to be involved, we could see the fortification logo to pop out. We still need to see if it is correctly iodized. Then another one is laboratories. And I think I talked a little bit, but to make sure that the country has at least one laboratory that can offer it on real time, or at least on a speedy time, at an effective costs, the analysis of those products, both for the government but also for private sector, is a very important enabler. This is something that we are working in Mozambique. It's a work in progress. But we hope that in 3 or 4 months, the national lab already can process much more samples, and that they can support private sector. Because at the moment, if you are a producer in Mozambique, you need to send your samples to South Africa, and it's quite expensive, and also it takes a long time. And if you decide to test before you put your product on the market, you're going to be with your product a long time on your warehouse, and producers really don't like that. So some of the priorities, just to summarize, we have, of course, legislation, political will, enforcement, financial and human capacity, civil society, better data, of course, and relationship building. It is a work in progress, and I must say that since we started working in salt iodization in Mozambique, I've seen all the partners come to the table, and I think we are all aware that regulatory monitoring is a very important step that we need to achieve soon, and Mozambique is working on it. And I leave you to welcome to my country.
This is Mozambique, land of golden sun, land of people open and warm, landscape rich and vast with beauty unmatched. Mozambique, you are my home. This is Mozambique. Hoyo, 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 hoyo.
So Hope to see you in Mozambique on your next holidays. And as they say in the local language of my hometown, that is Maputo, Kanimambo. Sorry, Robin, I forgot to introduce you. Now it's Robin Houston he's a senior advisor from the Iodine Global Network.
Thank you very much, Katya. That was actually a delightful video. I'm glad we saw that. I'm going to talk about the use of iodized food and the use of iodized salt in processed foods, which I think from IGN's perspective we see as a sort of an important next step to stabilizing iodine intake and to ensure sort of a sustainable, long-term, well into the future iodine sufficiency globally. I'm going to talk a little bit, as we've talked always, to thank again the salt industry for this, what is arguably one of the most important public health successes in the last decade. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the trends in processed food use, and then some evidence on its contribution to iodine intake, and then a little bit about IGN's role in moving this agenda forward. I had a bunch of slides that talked about the success, but I actually decided I might add a little personal anecdote to this rather than slides that many of you have already seen. I was involved in the IDD movement quite early, and I remember in the 80s in Nepal, a country that I worked in for a number of years, there was an airport in western Nepal, and every time you went to that airport, you bumped into this fellow who would come and offer to take your bags out to the place where you needed to go. And he was deaf-mute and clearly cognitively impaired. And the airport sort of tolerated him. He was just there. He was most likely a Cretan. And it would be my guess that globally the number of Cretans born today is nearing zero. And that's a huge accomplishment. And I also would comment on, earlier one of the presenters talked about Pakistan, and I actually was in the state that started iodization or started some of the effort there in Swat. And at that time, if you were to measure the goiters in school children, you might get 50% with small goiters. And when I go travel, most recently, although I'm mostly retired now, when I ask pediatricians if they see goiters in school children, I have yet to find one in the last 5 years who has said they see that. So that's also a sort of a personal story about the remarkable success if we use goiter as a measure of the of iodine sufficiency and the diminishing goiter rates as a measure of the improvement in cognitive abilities for children. That's an amazing contribution, and it really has all fallen on the backs of industry. So I wanted to preface the sort of the success story with those stories, because to me it's an amazing success story, and industry is largely responsible for that. So the traditional model has been household salt. That's where everything sort of started. The focus for all the effort early on was if we could get iodine in household salt, then we could basically eliminate this problem. So this is our traditional model, that you basically get salt producers to add this to salt used in households. And I think what we wanted to do is to change that model sorry, these are sequential, and to add into that model use of processed foods. And in the next few slides, I'll go through the rationale for that. The basic premise here is that if we can consider universal salt iodization as something that goes beyond just household salt, then we're more likely to sustain adequate iodine intake and make countries iodine sufficient into the future in a way that will be easier, I think, for everybody. Now, there's a lot of complexity to moving in this direction because processed foods are varied. Countries are wildly variable in the reach of processed foods. But generally speaking, this model, I think, will stabilize iodine intake into the future. In fact, WHO guidelines mention specifically that universal salt iodization really should include all salt for human consumption. And early on, that was really interpreted, let's get household salt iodized. But now, really, we need to focus on making it all salt for human consumption, which would include processed foods. So processed foods, a wide array of definitions. This is one definition, and it really talks about any agricultural product that's been processed in some way, whether it's heating, washing, milling, whatever, processing it in a way that implies some kind of industrial processing and then reaches the market as an altered food or a food that has undergone a number of steps in its evolution. But we're really concerned, as you can imagine, with foods that meet a certain criteria, foods that have a high enough salt content that in the event that that salt were iodized, it would make a significant contribution to iodine intake, or to foods that may have a smaller salt content, but that are sort of universally used. So in some countries, including some of the countries in Russia and the former Russian republics, these countries often had widespread use of bread that may be commercially produced, and therefore that's an opportunity to add iodine. That's made actually quite a contribution to iodine sufficiency in several countries. Some convenience foods, which may be used widely, and then some preserved foods, and I'll get back to that a little bit later. So these foods really contribute to salt intake, but they also contribute to an opportunity to add iodine to that salt and therefore help stabilize iodine intake. There are a lot of regional trends. I think I found this in one of the business journals that talked about segmented markets and what's happening in processed food use. North America, of course, where we have lots of processed foods. Europe has a high demand, but they have more strict regulations. In Asia, the processed food market is growing dramatically, even in countries like Nepal, which I'm very familiar with, where the reach of processed noodles is almost universal now. And it's in other countries, this market is growing. And in fact, I found some estimate that this processed food market, now this is of course not all just salty condiments and the ones I've mentioned, but the overall market is a huge market financially. This is a slide that just goes through some of the details on how much contribution to salt intake is from processed foods. So we think about household salt and table salt and what you put on. That actually in many countries is a small contribution to overall salt intake, and thus a small contribution to iodine intake if that's the only source of iodine. And when we go through a table that goes through this, most countries that have been examined thoroughly, about a third at least of salt intake is from processed foods. So this really gives an idea of the opportunity to iodize that salt and therefore stabilize the iodine intake. Australia, for example, I think it's already come up. Australia has good consumer protections and some consumer pushback to mandatory fortification. So instead, they mandated just iodization of salt for use in bread, and that made a huge difference in the average intake of iodine and in moving Australia from a deficient country to a sufficient country. Many countries now have mandatory legislation for salt iodization. In theory, many of these enforce those, and that's helped contribute to the success that we've seen. But even though most of these, 96 out of 108, include in the wording of the legislation that it should apply to processed foods, most countries really don't enforce that. It's really been focused mostly on household salt to date. In some countries, it's selective. The legislation is selective, as I mentioned in Australia. In other countries, it specifically excludes processed foods. So one of the questions that comes up is whether or not adding iodine to the processing of food would change the organoleptic properties of the food. This was early on an issue for pickled products, but generally speaking, this was a concern. Would producers of a processed food lose market share because consumers would reject it because of either taste or other factors? So there were some studies on this, and basically those studies really didn't show significant organoleptic property changes with the use of iodine. There were a few exceptions. Some products that had citric in them had a little bitter or metallic flavor, but for the most part, you really didn't see changes from the consumer would not be able to notice that iodized salt had been used. There were some studies also looked at retention. That's a different issue, and I'm not going to talk very much about that. So how does IGN, what's our IGN's role in this? IGN has been developing a guide because in most cases, project managers, those responsible for the iodine program in a country, really don't know what the contribution of processed foods is. For example, in Ghana, I did some work in Ghana not too many years ago, and they have a large number of small producers, and it's been very frustrating to get their household salt percentage up. But in the meantime, when you do a population survey and look at their iodine levels have been sufficient. And nobody really could pinpoint exactly what was contributing to that iodine intake. And there were then some small-scale studies looking at bullion. And it turns out that over the past decade, bullion use in Ghana has increased dramatically and now reaches a large percent of the population. And the bullion producers at the time were almost by default using iodized salt. And bullion is a salty product with a wide population reach, and most likely bullion is the reason why Ghana has achieved iodine sufficiency. So it was a good example of a situation that happened without really a great understanding on the part of the people who managed the program. So IGN has created a guide. It's in its draft form. It's nearly completed, and it's designed to allow those responsible for the iodine programs in country to undergo a process where they can understand the contribution of processed foods. And there are a number of modules. There's an overview, there's a situation analysis guide, and a guide to the language of the legislation so that loopholes could be closed and you could move that legislation towards something more effective in having processed foods use iodized salt. And then probably the most important one was the methods. How do you go about assessing this? And so I just wanted to focus on that one. It helps to identify the largest salt products that are in the market and what their reach is. It's a guide, helps to understand how much of a contribution that is to overall salt intake. It helps estimate the proportion of salt used that is iodized or not iodized, and therefore allows a program manager to estimate if we could get these products to use iodized salt, will that make a big difference in iodine consumption, and will that help stabilize or make us move toward a sufficiency situation? So in conclusion, I wanted to just, again, congratulate, I suppose, the salt industry for the overwhelming global success of salt iodization, and then to maybe request the salt industry to look at this issue of adding iodine to processed foods as a way to sort of stabilize. I think it's fair to say that we have achieved salt iodization in many places as just part of manufacturing. The industry covers the costs, and it's part of good manufacturing procedure. If that could be applied, somewhat selectively perhaps, to processed foods, then I think it lays the foundation for a sustainable iodine intake and allowing the achievement that we have achieved, allowing that to persist for future generations with a little less effort on the part of global organizations, public health organizations, and industry itself. So with that, I'd thank you for being here. And I wanted to introduce Jonathan Gorstein, who is the executive director for IGN, and he's going to speak about another opportunity, which is potential for salt to be used for other vehicles. Jonathan?
Good morning again. It's good to see that a lot more people showed up for the second session than the first session. I'm going to take the liberty actually to comment on the two earlier presentations, and as an executive director it does is to sort of plug some additional initiatives. Katya gave a beautiful presentation about different enablers for the government to support salt iodization programs. And the first enabler was about information systems and the use of data. So on my left is a banner talking about what is a global data exchange, or the Global Fortification Data Exchange, which is an opportunity that we have put together, the IGN, Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, the Micronutrient Forum, and the Food Fortification Initiative to standardize the way in which data on food fortification programs is presented and compiled. Previous to the GFDX, we were all defining the way in which we were working with different food vehicles in different ways, standards, legislation, but the GFDX has been an effort to come together to harmonize our efforts to be able to have information not only more standardized, but as Katya alludes to, more useful, particularly for decision makers at the country level, to know what is the current status and current situation of data. So you can scan this little bar on the poster, and please do take a look. And the other comment I was going to make with regard to Robin's great presentation on the use of iodized salt in processed foods is that yesterday we heard a lot of presentations, and we saw a lot of data on the total salt intake in diets, estimated primarily from urinary sodium collected over 24 hours. And those estimates have given us a pretty good idea of what the mean salt intake is in different populations, how that has remained relatively constant over the last 20, 30 years. What we've been trying to do is go a little bit deeper and compartmentalize and break down that total salt intake, and to understand how much of that salt is coming from different sources. Robin also pointed out the fact that while we are now including iodized salt and its use in processed foods as part of the USI paradigm, we recognize that ultimately it's still about salt iodization. It's still about working with the salt industry. And we will really benefit from the salt producers to help us understand how much of the salt that you're producing is being channeled through retail markets to consumers directly, and how much of that salt is going to the food industry. In a way, if we can be a bit more strategic, more efficient, and effective in the way that salt supply is being undertaken, it may help us better understand how much salt is being consumed, how much of that salt is iodized, and then to further salt iodization and improvement of iodine nutrition aspirations. And as I mentioned earlier, if absolute salt intake reduces, we just increase the amount of iodine that's in that salt to be able to meet physiological requirements. Salt is a great vehicle. On that, in that vein, I'm going to speak very quickly because we have a panel discussion that I don't want to preempt. But I want to speak about an initiative that's been undertaken over the last 20 years, primarily in research laboratories, to explore the viability of using salt not only for the fortification of iodine, but also to use it as a vehicle for fortification with other nutrients, primarily iron. So clearly what's happened is that there's been a tremendous success around universal salt iodization. Public-private partnerships have come together, programs have been established, systems are in place, and salt iodization coverage, as you've seen in a few of our presentations, is now upwards of 86% throughout the low and middle income countries. Tremendous success that we've been able to work with you, salt producers, to be able to use this vehicle to be able to get additional nutrients, iodine, into diets. Well, that's not been lost on other public health nutritionists who have looked at the success of USI and said maybe we can explore the opportunity of using that same program paradigm, but add additional nutrients to the diet. And again, I'm going to sort of go through this relatively quickly. The rationale for using salt as a vehicle are well established, and there should be really no questions. The consistency in the amount of salt that's consumed across socioeconomic groups, across geographies, again, makes it a perfect vehicle. So fast forward to double fortified salt. One of the reasons why iron has been explored is because of the widespread burden of anemia. Anemia affects all population groups, particularly pregnant women. This map is the recent WHO prevalence map that shows just what is the absolute burden of anemia in different populations. What we know about anemia is that it has profound physiological consequences, not the least of which is also reduced productivity, economic development at the individual, household, and population level. We also know that anemia is multifactorial. The primary driver in many developing countries of anemia is a lack of iron in the diet. There are other factors, helminth infections, malaria, and the like, but a lot of anemia is in fact caused by iron insufficiency in the diet. And there's been some consideration of how to improve iron in the diet through fortification, primarily of staple foods of maize, rice, and wheat flour. I should have not gone through this with animation. I apologize. But there's also been some work that's been done primarily by Nutrition International to develop compounds of iron that would not interact adversely with iodine in salt and be able to provide iron to diets of populations. We're excited about the potential of double fortified salt, but we're also very mindful of the fact that there are technical and programmatic considerations that need to be better understood. The initial efficacy studies of DFS have demonstrated that the provision of iron in salt together with iodine can have dramatic effects in terms of reducing anemia and also the absolute iron levels in the diet. Pretty clear. If you provide a food that includes iron in a population that's deficient, then that population will improve. The biggest challenge has been around the technology, and I'm going to move through these next slides relatively quickly, again, because I'd rather have our focus today be on the panel discussion with salt producers. But suffice it to say that there's been enough advances in the technology around double fortified salt that it has now been introduced in public distribution programs in India on a pretty large scale. Double fortified salt is now being provided to over 66 million consumers through the public distribution program. This is me going through my slides quickly. So there are 66 million beneficiaries who are targeted because of poverty or able to acquire double fortified salt at essentially a highly subsidized price. Double fortified salt through the public distribution systems in India is really effective because there's one major salt producer, one major premix manufacturer, so it's very controlled and very, very tight quality assurance in the way that the double fortified salt is being provided. The price margin, which is not insignificant, is absorbed by the government. So for a social protection program which aims to provide additional iron to vulnerable populations, the provision of double fortified salt through such a delivery modality is very, very promising and exciting. Whether or not DFS can be viable outside of public distribution programs and as part of normal commercial markets remains to be seen. I actually just heard about a product that's being that you're producing in Argentina. Is this correct? So there are a lot of initial explorations of using salt as a vehicle for multiple fortification, and we really want to try to learn more about that. The IGN, as part of the work that we do and our convening mandate, is to we're putting together a large technical consultation of major researchers, scientists, program managers from all over the world in order to review the evidence around the efficacy, the technical requirements for double fortified salt, as well as what are some of the operational considerations for delivery of double fortified salt. As part of that consultative process, we've convened a steering group of a who's who of people that I'm constantly in awe of the fact that we're able to work together with to really provide guidance on what are the optimal conditions under which DFS could be successful in a country program. This process will then lead to a series of state-of-the-art publications on double fortified salt and evidence-based guidance to countries that are interested in considering double fortified salt. And really the aspirations of that guide are twofold. One is to spell out what are the minimum conditions and characteristics that need to be in place for there to be successful introduction of double fortified salt. But by doing that, the inverse is also really important. And that is by spelling out what is required, we also want to identify what are the conditions under which the introduction of double fortified salt could actually be potentially harmful to USI programs and to the success that we've achieved with universal salt iodization. So it's an exciting new initiative. I didn't want to, get into a whole lot of detail other than to put it on your radar that this is something that's being explored. And as Robin alluded to earlier, the reason why we're even thinking about double fortified salt is because of the success that has been achieved through salt iodization. And I look out amongst you at the salt producers who've been able to make that happen. And as we begin to explore the viability, feasibility, one very important consideration is the business sense of doing this, and we'll need to learn that from you. And Rishi is a member of the steering group, and we do plan to reach out to other salt producers and industry associations to better understand the context under which DFS would be most appropriate and viable. I would be more than pleased to respond to any technical or other programmatic questions that you may have regarding DFS, but given that we have just about 25 minutes, I'm going to stop right now. I'm going to ask Robin to come back up to lead a discussion of salt for salt producers, and with that, we'll go through the mechanics of getting that organized. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you.
We're going to just make a way to put some chairs up here for the panel, but I'd like to invite the panelists to come up. We have 4 people on the panel: Luiz Satano, who has experience from Brazil, Rishi Kansangra, who has experience from Nigeria and other countries, Sergio Marino from Mexico, and Garsaj Narsi from Mozambique. So if you all could come up here and sit here, I think you've all been mic'd already. So many of you have been following this discussion and may have some questions on this, somewhat tricky interface between public policy, public health, which is often described as the interface between health and politics, and the food industry, who are basically business trying to have a viable business. So if there are questions, yes, please.
One of the questions that I have regarding particular presentation on iodized salt in processed foods is the fact that there's only one standard for food-grade salt, the Codex Alimentarius standard, and that has no mention of iodine anywhere. Regardless of the source of salt, be it solar salt, be it the solution mine salt, the standard states that you have to have a minimum of 97% sodium chloride, and that's the official FAO standard. That is copied in other countries under other names, but they always refer back to the Codex Alimentarius standard. Is there any way that the concept of iodization can work its way into the food grade standard for salt, so that in fact, if a manufacturer is considering using it, at least he's using something that has been standardized and recognized as an international standard for salt?
It's an interesting question. I wonder if any of you all want to comment on the role of the Codex standard for food-grade salt with respect to your industry perspective. I will comment that certainly in many countries, that standard is not really taken into consideration because some of the small-scale producers, it's a fairly rudimentary process for producing salt.
For example, in Mexico, the health regulations, it's an obligation to use a salt fortificate with iodine in food industry, but not in all countries. In Mexico, yes, since 1991, and the results are very positive. For example, in 1991, only 20% of salt, table salt, even food industry, had iodine. And at these days, more or less 90% has iodine, including food industry. But I don't know the codex standard. It's contemplate the food industry salt for food industry must be fortified with iodine. I'm not sure about that. I don't know if you.
I would like to say experience in Brazil. The legislation says that it is compulsory all salt sold in the market to be iodized, even for processing foods. So there is one exception. If the process of the food or the industry has any impact with the iodine, they can ask and justify to buy salt without iodine. But it is compulsory to sell any kind of salt. To put in the market, it has to be iodine.
The same case in Mexico.
I guess the point I want to make is that you're not allowed to declare salt as food-grade salt unless it complies to the Codex Alimentarius definition. So ultimately, what I was kind of getting at is that this group should, in fact, try to liaise with the FAO Codex Alimentarius Commission so that at the next round of defining what food, or refining what food-grade salt is, that there could be a section devoted to food-grade iodized salt. That was the point.
Jonathan?
I'm going to shout real quickly. So IGN actually has a special session at the World Health Assembly in 2019, and one of the objectives of the WHO of IGN participation is to review the Codex Alimentarius and the provision not only of the minimum sodium chloride content, but also to define what is an acceptable range of iodine to be added and the compounds that can be added, so that, again, as we push towards the inclusion of language of iodized salt used in processed foods and legislation, that there will be at least some general guidance. And WHO actually asked us to provide some of those parameters. Thanks.
I was just wondering whether or not anybody has experience with exported salt and whether the ISO standards require some monitoring of the codex for food-grade salt.
Sorry, I have a question. The point raised by Mort is very valid because we just have to work as a team to have this incorporated in the Codex Alimentarius, because more than half of the world is following Codex Alimentarius. And there is one more ambiguity, and that is 30% of the world is using potassium iodide. 70% of the world is using potassium iodate. So we should start thinking on these lines also, that it should be harmonized. Or if there is a technical reason behind these two different forms of iodine, both are forms of iodine, potassium iodate as well as potassium iodide. So, if anybody can enlighten us that why is it potassium iodide in some parts of the world, whereas potassium iodate in rest of the world?
I can comment on that by dint of my age. Early on, use of potassium iodate was favored for the simple reason that it was more stable. So at the early onset of the USI movement, there was concern about iodine losses, particularly in large packages which would go out to retailers and often sit outside. And potassium iodide is a bit more volatile, and the losses might have been higher. So it's in some ways a historic vestige of the past. I think some of the more sophisticated producers in Europe and in the U.S. Had been using potassium iodide for some time. So I think that's partly the discrepancy. I know early on there was an encouragement for countries who were beginning USI programs to use potassium iodate because it was more stable. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I'd like to go back to the question of Mort. Our experience says that most of the companies who process the salt for their food, they have their own specification. And we sell them under specification. Sometimes not just how pure in sodium chloride it is, but what's the content of magnesium and calcium also. And sometimes the size of the grain also. Mm-hmm. So food grade salt, at least in Brazil, it depends on the specification of the buyer.
But must be the same content of iodine. In Brazil,
But-
it's the same kind,
but
right?
Also, the iodine has to be in the range of the federal government
Yeah.
legislation.
Mexico too.
They cannot change. They cannot change this particular.
Can I just is this on? Can I just add one more thing? Slightly off topic but relevant, is that I think salt, whilst there are exceptions, generally salt doesn't get, once it's manufactured, doesn't get imported and exported tremendously due to the transport costs and the low value. Manufactured foods do, and what we've seen is in the last 10 years a rapid rise, as you said, in terms of in Africa, the consumption of manufactured foods. It's taken a while for the international community to cotton on to that, but as you see that happening, you see more imported manufactured foods coming in to fill that gap, made in mass factories in Asia or outside of Africa. Whilst they're not held to the same standards of iodization, etc., it's going to put more pressure on local producers, I can see over the course of the next 5 years, who are held to those standards of iodization, to, whilst they look for ways, whilst the cost is marginal, but they're always looking for ways to reduce costs, with cost pressures. And I do think we've got to bear that in mind as well, that manufactured foods are always going to be, due to the higher profit margin, there's always going to be more attempts to import and export and trade those internationally than there is with salt.
Hello. I do have a philosophical question for the industry. I think you've heard me talk that Mozambique has 400 micro producers, and we've been discussing this in country. We understand consolidation is a big step to achieve universal salt iodization. But my philosophical question, and Nielsen has heard me say this before, and Garcês also, is it feasible to transform 400 producers and to come up with an economic model that can incorporate all of those, only looking at iodized salt? Because sometimes I feel, and I have a hunch, that we are so focused on salt iodization that we forget that maybe the economic model for those micro producers, and that salt is their livelihood, maybe should be looking at fleur de sal or something different, or aggregating them to produce other types of salt. So you guys are very experienced salt producers. We would appreciate the advice.
Okay, yes, okay. Good morning, all of friends of salts. I think it's possible. We have experience of Tanzania, we have experience of India, of Pakistan. that we must, the first thing that we must do is to create the association of that macro producer. Pardon, my English is poor, but I will try. My language is Portuguese, I try. I think this is possible. That's why we are supported to create the association in that micro producer. But creating micro producers is not enough. We must give the equipment. The equipment is very important. Not to create it, not create it without giving machine for that. I think that is it's enough.
You mean they're supposed to learn them how to work, give them technology and capital to improve their production?
Yes, yes.
That's it?
Yes. Or another is to aggregate that sources of micro produce for the big industry, if it's nearby. Because we have experience of one salt in our counter called salts of God. Because when the CS or the high CS entry, the population take that salts is their subsistence. Mm-hmm. They take salt and cells without increase the iodate, potassium. That's why it's possible to get that salts and give a big industry for iodizate that salt.
One other thing I think it's very important. For example, in Mexico, we had huge producers of salt, huge companies, but also we have small producers. And a few years ago, maybe 8 or 10 years, the Iodine Global Network visit us to give advice to the small producers, and we did a manual for process for fortified iodine salt, and give it to the small producers. Depends their capacity of production, the size of the machines, even the costs of the machines, to adequate her needs, right? And also I think it's very important to sensibilize, to inform also to the salt producers, the small, medium, or huge producers, the importance of fortified iodized the salt, because many times they took like an obligation, they don't like it, but if you see the benefits, the importance of that, you feel proud to contribute in this. It's very important, the message, the sense of the message, the positive communication of that contribution of salt, because a lot of people doesn't know about the importance of salts with iodine.
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a bit a comment also on Mort as on Jonathan, with another question: why is the World Health Organization not involved here today? Because you can put a lot of pressure on the salt industry to have iodization, but in many regions they push just limits on the use of salt, and especially, for instance, World Health Organization is working on a nutrient profile, which would limit the possibilities of adding certain nutrients to certain food products, for instance, like iodine to salt. And if you have all the burden put on the industry, for instance, in Europe, what is happening is that the European Commission is saying, well, we will rely for our public health to what World Health Organization Europe will do, and for them, iodine is not a top priority. So also at European level, there's no push even to recognize iodine deficiency in Europe as a major public health issue. So you can put all the efforts on the industry, but if there is no regulator helping to either promote or make it possible to have iodized salt on the market, then you will never get iodine deficiency out of Europe also.
Jonathan, do you want to respond to that?
I take your points, Roger. I'm just going to keep the message very positive, and that is that we engage and we make the effort and we reach out. Your points are extremely, extremely well taken. Also yours, Mort, about trying to make sure that the FAO, Codex Alimentarius, is as flexible and accommodating to the realities of the salt industry as possible. One of the nice things about IGN is that we are, in fact, a platform for these discussions to happen. Your point's just well taken. We actually did propose that there would be an opportunity for WHO to speak about their salt reduction policy. And because of, I think, very understandable reasons, they were not able to come. So we took the position as IGN that we are aware of WHO's policies of salt reduction. We're mindful of those, and we are just so focused on salt as a vehicle for the delivery of iodine and potentially other fortificants, that's what we do. Everything that we do, we inform WHO about, and we just hope that by being transparent, engaging, is a way to maintain a dialogue.
When I started in 2007 with EU Salt, WHO was really engaged, and there was a huge push from the World Health Organization on iodine. But in the course of the years, they lost interest, and they even have a sort of limit of meeting the industry. And what we see also in Europe, because we really are pushing to meet up with the World Health Organization, their office in Europe, in Denmark, they just refuse to comment on the industry. So there is somewhere a lack also from the public regulation to get into speaking with the industry.
Thanks. I understand the reason for trying to broaden the sources of iodine coming into food. If there is a push to put iodized salt into processed foods, and a lot of those processed foods are being exported to various countries, how do you think that's actually going to play out and be managed in countries where there's already programs where iodine is sufficient, and you have random amounts coming in the imports of processed foods?
Any comment on that?
I want to go back with Walter, the comment of Walter. I totally agree with you, because the World Health Organization or Pan American Health Organization, I think it's something like he doesn't hear us. No, we have to have a dialogue with them, to found a common language, to change the narrative, as you said yesterday, Morton, something like that. I totally agree with you.
Just to comment on your question, I think the question about whether or not imported products that have iodized salt used in the processed food, and how does that relate to a country that, for example, may be sufficient. I think that puts the burden on the public health community to have an adequate surveillance or monitoring system to be able to track population iodine levels. Although, with iodine as an intervention, we're quite lucky in that the consequences of a bit too much are pretty negligible. So it's not a major concern, but it's something that needs to be tracked. But I would like to ask industry representatives here, this is going to be a complex thing to achieve. And I'd love to hear some input about how, let's say, countries do move in the direction of adding iodine to processed foods. From an industry perspective, how would that be monitored? How would you track that? How would you understand what was happening? For example, the salt industry may have an increase in salt sales, iodized salt sales to the food industry, or more demand shifting from regular salt to iodized salt. what are the pieces that might go in place from an industry perspective that would help understand that very question?
Well, that's an example, as I said before, in Brazil, all salt has to be iodized. We cannot sell any kind of salt without iodine. So, except if the industry asks for and justify it. So, the market is iodized salt. There's no way to sell any kind of salt to put in the market without iodine.
I think from an African perspective, that chain that you mentioned, a local salt producer supplying a local manufacturer, I think actually that's relatively easy. I wouldn't be too. I think that local manufacturers, as of now, as far as I see it, are of a scale where they would be more willing to follow. They'd be more willing to follow regulation without having strict enforcement, which is, as you know, weak. So I've not had personal experience of seeing industry. I've seen industry think about trying to take it out by engaging with regulation, but I've not seen them try to evade regulation. So I think that would be relatively positive. As long as the food entering, the iodine that's entering a person is to come from that chain, as it is currently in, like, for example, as you said, in Ghana, then I think that's manageable for now, definitely, and sustainable.
Any other comments on that?
In Mexico, it's the same case than Luis said. All kind of salt must be iodized.
So you don't have food industry, for example, coming to you and say, we're concerned about iodine and we'd like to get regular salt for our food.
No, there are exceptions, for example, in the, how do you say mayonnaise? Mayonnaise? You can't use iodized salt because the color of the food changes.
So they get an exception.
It's an exception.
For example, in my country, we have the rulers say that we can't sell the salts without iodine, but we have the problems of the population that's inside the country. The country is big. The system of the estradas, como é que é? Estradas, caminhos.
I don't know.
For to arrive there, where we have the most of population, because rural population have the problems of that, and the governments have not the human resource for Chile, because our country is not rich everywhere. But we try to growing. That's why it's very difficult to take one inspector to inside the country. Como Brazil, chegar lá no interior do Brasil, it's very difficult. But we try to work well. We must work hard for dissemination that information, for that the people must consume iodide salts.
Must know about the benefits of consuming
they must know.
iodized salt.
But I think another question has to be considered is that the legislation says the amount of iodine it must be in the salt, but not in the food. There is no, as far as I know, there is no specification for the food, the content of iodine in the food.
No, I
so
think.
It varies quite a bit.
Yeah, in fact, there was a review of legislation related to processed foods, and it's mixed. And the language is often unclear enough to not really be very clear about use of iodized salt in processed foods. So I think that's correct. We have about a minute and a half. A couple more questions.
Hello, my name is Glenn. I'm from the Philippines. I have a question for a person from Mozambique. I think your co-countryman who, I forgot your name, sorry, Ms. Diaz, mentioned that you have some strong private-public partnerships that maybe we can learn from. So, what specific iodine advocacies or iodized salt campaigns between private and public or government partnerships have you done successfully?
Garcia, do you want me to respond? Do you want to respond?
No, no, you can.
Okay, so since 2016, private sector, government, and development actors have been working together to try establish new models, sustainable, inclusive models to achieve universal salt iodization, because in almost 20 years on the old models it wasn't working. At the moment, there is no real communication around fortification or salt iodization at the moment. We are preparing to do that. But what has been done is that a baseline for the sector has been done in terms of production and to try to identify what is the economy around the salt sector and where the producers stand, where they are, what's their production capability, because there was a big vacuum in terms of knowledge. And that's what I said, that we even had to do kind of a census to try to identify where are the producers and segment it. The other thing is that we did the same baseline on the government sectors that are involved in law enforcement. So Ministry of Industry, our national labs, our Bureau of Standards, our laboratories, all of them went through a baseline to trying to understand where are the gaps that we need to work together as partners to try to fill those gaps. At what we are at the moment all together trying to do, a very important, is trying to create the first national salt association in country. There's only one salt association in country, and they only represent the producers in the south of the country. So this is a big gap, and where we all are all together trying to find out the best way to set up regional associations, because Mozambique is a big country, and then a national association that can represent the interests of all salt producers. So this is a joint work. It's not just the private sector, not just the government, but all of us. And the next step is to make sure that that association has the right management tools, technical tools to be a very important voice. The other thing is that we called the consumers to be at the table. And I think that's quite also unique. A lot of times countries do forget that the consumer associations need to be an ally, right? They, at the same time, they will talk about salt reduction, but they will talk to make sure that the consumer is aware and that their rights are defended, and that people, when they buy salt, they can have the confidence that that salt is iodized. So this year we planned also to revamp the industry in the aspect of making sure that they improve their technology, that they are aware and have all the training and skills to make sure that at least those 23 producers that represent around 80% of the market share will have salt that is correctly iodized in the market. But at the same time, we will be working with the government, and with the salt producers, exactly to make sure that we find a business model or models that will incorporate those 400 micro-producers. And when I ask the panel, when I mean micro-producers is someone that produces 2 bags of 25 kilos a week. That's really a micro-producer in Mozambique. How do we make sure that those people, that salt is part of their livelihoods, are not left behind? We don't want to leave we can't leave anyone behind in Mozambique, right? We still have a lot of food security issues in country. So this, I think, for us, the model has been that we are really working together. We are fighting together. Every day we have very lively meetings of the national committee where we all fight because we all defend a point of view. And I think this is something that I think we are all very proud, right? This collaborative model that we are developing, and being truthful to each other, fighting when it's necessary, and each one of us kind of defending our point of view, which sometimes Nilse is laughing, but we fight a lot. I mean, she represents the government, I represent public health, so yeah. I don't know if I responded to your question.
Thank you,
You
Kathy.
can all-
I see from the red light that we are over and extending into lunch, which is always risky. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming. Certainly, these will be available to you, these presentations, and I hope that a meeting like this provides networking opportunities for everybody. IGN has a website. You can always contact us through that. So thank you very much for coming.